Hello, I want to share some thoughts from this book, Religion and Your Well-Being. This is a book that is meant to help us utilize religious indoctrination to promote human dignity and well-being. For instance, if you are wrongly indoctrinated about God, you may be tempted to think that in order to create space for God, to make religion relevant in the affairs of humanity, we must downplay the human abilities or the human efforts that we use to solve human problems that border on human survival and happiness. So the thinking is that if I'm exploring my creativity, innovativeness, using some technology, scientific works, I am using some AI tools, or engaging in some human efforts to try to solve human problems, to create food, to ensure food security, to create shelter, create clothes, build roads, means of communication, means of transportation, solve health problems, and so on. What then are we living for God to do? What problems are we living for God to solve? Because it is really the case that after all spiritual activities, religious activities, we must still eat. We must have a place to sleep. We must drive on good roads. We must have means of transport, and so on. So then how do we make God relevant to our survival if we can solve these problems using some human efforts and abilities? That is why for some people, to them, the way they can build God consciousness in their everyday activities is to downplay on some abilities that they have, is to belittle their human efforts or abilities, is sometimes to make themselves vulnerable, feel inadequate, incompetent, incapable. What are they trying to do? They are trying to create space for God to be relevant in their affairs as a way of appreciating God and pleasing God and making God happy. The unfortunate aspect of this kind of thinking is that these people are not likely to be the ones to be involved in doing creative work, involved in innovation. They are not going to be the ones manufacturing some products. They are not going to be the ones making cars for people to drive, building mobile phones for people to use. They are not going to be the ones to build factories to create products. They are likely not to be the ones to process their raw materials, process their gold, process their cocoa and all that. Because unconsciously, they are thinking that they must leave some room for God to fill, some gap for God to fill. Unfortunately, these people will face the challenge of being deprived of many basic things that border on human survival. So they'll not have food security, they'll struggle with water, sanitation, they have bad roads, bad healthcare systems, they have to depend on donor support, and always they have to look elsewhere. They are the ones that are likely to be excited when they get a visa to go to other countries that people are applying themselves and creating beautiful cities and beautiful living for their citizens. Somehow, these people can pray for things they don't create. Other people have to create these things for them, create the cars for them. They pray for them, but they don't create them. So, in effect, it leads to poor quality of life. And when we talk about poor quality of life, because of poor healthcare, bad roads, lack of food security, and so on, it borders on human dignity and well-being. And that's why I'm having this discussion with you. How do you solve this problem? Whereby you want to acknowledge God, you want to appreciate God, you want to create this God consciousness in a human being. But at the same time, also, you're not going to act as if you are less human than other human beings who are creating airplanes and mobile phones and using drones and machines to grow food. How do you balance the two? Number one, you have to understand that when we talk about your God-given identity or your religious beliefs, there should be two components, and there are two components to that. The first one is that you have God, who is a person who deserves to be worshipped. And the second component of that religious belief should be that you look like God. Because the same reference books or text or scriptures that remind us about God also remind us that the human being is created by God. So you cannot be talking about God, 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 and not be talking about the fact that the human being is created to look like God. The two must go hand in hand. So you don't just have God, you also look like God. And because you look like God, you have some God's ability in you, because God has given you dominion over the earth, giving you earth resources, and asked you to rule over the earth. What it means is that you have what it takes to understand human problems and create solutions to solve them. So a person who actually does not only think that he has God, but also thinks he looks like God, is likely to be the one that is believing that, well, if I look like God, then I can engage in activities. I have what it takes to engage in activities that are relevant to human survival and well-being. And that person is not going to be thinking that when he's achieving something, he's creating something, God is threatened. Rather, the thinking will be that he or she is likely to underutilize God's potential in the human being because we don't know the extent of this potential. So, the best of human achievements, innovativeness, creativity, efforts to solve human problems cannot make us think that we have exhausted God's ability in a human being. All the time, we are going to be having more of God's ability in us that we could ever use. And so when you think like this, you are never going to think that there's any human exploit that can intimidate God or can threaten God, that can make God feel irrelevant in the affairs of the human being. Another way to think when it comes to that concern that you're not acknowledging God enough by trying to solve human problems is to know that because God is a good and a loving God who cares about human well, all efforts we put into trying to solve human problems, to make life comfortable for the human being, to fight threats to human well-being, to help the human being survive, they are not supposed to be seen as we are working against God. So if I'm a doctor and I'm in the hospital and the patient is suffering in pain and is dying and it comes there, and then I use the human knowledge that I have learned on human diseases and treatments to make that patient feel better and go home, and the patient did not die, I'm not supposed to feel bad to think that I am replacing God. That's something that ought to be done by a miracle. I am trying to do it using science to do it. I'm supposed to think that God's ability that He has given we human beings enabled us to find solutions to diseases, health problems. And then I'm going to learn some of this, and it gives me the opportunity or the privilege to help a fellow human being who is suffering. That's how I'm supposed to think. So it is not true that human efforts to solve problems are threats to God's ego. It is not true. It is also not true that the only way God is pleased is when we solve our problems by a miracle and not by using of His ability in us to solve these problems. So that before you conclude that, well, some things are not possible with man, but they are possible with God, you have to ask yourself the question, what is the context within which you're making this statement? Are you saying that's about a man in Japan or China or US, those who are creating some machines and cars? Or are you referring to this man in your locality? You must be aware of the context within which you are making that statement, because we can have teaching hospitals in a developing country that may not be able to do a transplant service or do some procedures on the heart, but such people can be flown to other countries on other continents, and they get the transplant service done, they get some procedures done. When we talk about human potential and God's ability in man, your exposure, your environment is not the best representation of what that best version of the human being is. We are referring to the human being anywhere in any part of the world. What that human being in any part of the world can do is a reflection of what God's ability in the human being that He created in His image can be, can do, and can have. So if you want to appreciate God, make God relevant, create God consciousness in your life every day, every time, what you should understand is that you don't necessarily need a reason to worship God, because you can worship God for who He is. He deserves our worship. He qualifies for our worship just for who He is. He doesn't have to come and grow food for you to deserve our worship. If you need another reason to worship God, you must understand that His efforts to take you to heaven ought to be appreciated. Now, we know that God is a good and loving God who cares about human well-being. And God could give His own life for us because He wants to take us to heaven. And we know how beautiful heaven is. That the most beautiful cities on this earth can still not be compared to heaven. So the best of human achievements in building cities now, and the best of human achievements in building cities in the future, can still not be compared to what heaven looks like. And God has given His own life for you because He really wants to take you to heaven. And you are saying that it is not enough. He must grow food for you to eat and build roads for you. That is not fair on God. If you need another reason to even appreciate God and make Him think that He's worthy of your worship, you can even acknowledge Him for even how He created you. That He created you in His image, gave you dominion over the earth, gave you resources. He says, rule over the earth. And He has done all these things so that you can create survival for yourself and for other people. So you can live a good life and not live a substandard life. You are saying that God has not done enough if He has not come to grow food for you to eat. We have to stop looking for excuses to blame God for the problems that He has given us the ability and resources to solve. If we really care about promoting human dignity and well-being, we must not only acknowledge that we have God, we must also acknowledge and appreciate the fact that we look like God.